Welcome, everyone, to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We are now in the second book of Shmuel, and we pick up on the 6th chapter. And here is a very well-known story in Shmuel Bet that in the previous class and the previous chapters, we discussed how David is now king over all of Israel. For 7.5 years, he was king of Yehuda, and the son of Shaul was still the king of the rest of Israel. And we went through the whole story of how he was, the son of Shaul was killed. And at that point, all of Israel comes to David and says, "You're chosen by God. You will be king over all of Israel." And then we learned how Israel conquered Jerusalem. And now we begin chapter 6, that the ark has not been with the Mishkan from the time that the Philistines had captured the ark and returned it. And they also conquered Shiloh. And so the Holy Ark was not with the rest of the Mishkan. And David wanted to rectify this. He wanted to bring the Ark up to Jerusalem. And so he calls together 30,000 people, and they're going to do this whole march up to Jerusalem with the Holy Ark. And what happens is they put the ark in a wagon, and it says that David sang and danced and played before the ark. They're doing this whole like pilgrimage up to Jerusalem. And it even mentions all the different instruments that they were playing. They were playing on all kinds of instruments of cypress wood, on lyres, on lutes, on timbrels, on rattles, on cymbals. In other words, it was a very, very joyous occasion. And then what happens is, as they're proceeding, the wagon either went over a rock or whatever it was. The whole wagon shook, and the ark was in danger of falling off. So Uzzah, that was his name, he tried to keep the ark in the wagon. And what happened, we really don't know exactly, but it says that the anger of God flared against Uzzah, and he died on the spot. Now, whether that means that we know that the ark had tremendous energy to it, what exactly happened is not clear, but Uzzah dies on the spot. And it says that David, the actual language, usually when it's translated here, it says David was displeased because God had burst out against Uzzah. But the actual Hebrew, it's not exactly that he was angry at God, but it means his face showed his displeasure, his confusion, his questioning. And then it says that David became very fearful of God, and he didn't know what to do. So he took the ark, and he felt that we can't continue to go up to Jerusalem with a whole joyous celebration that Uzzah just died. Now, the commentaries explain that the mistake here was actually David's. David was a great scholar, along with everything else that he was. He was a great student of Torah. And it says clearly in the making of the Mishkan and the service of the Mishkan that the ark had to be carried by the Levim on stakes, on the two staffs that came through the ark, so that it could be carried on by many people on both sides. It was not supposed to have been put in a wagon, and that was really David's mistake. And so part of his displeasure and fear of God was understanding that he made a mistake. He should have known better. Of course, he didn't do it on purpose. The commentaries also ask, well, how come when the Philistines returned the ark, they returned it in a wagon? And so they asked, well, what's the difference? They didn't die by touching it. But we know that the reason that they were returning it is because everywhere that they took the ark, their idols fell to the ground. There were all kinds of sickness and plagues and boils and all kinds of things. And they weren't commanded to carry it. That was for the Jewish people. So they returned it in a wagon. But here, David should have known better. So the ark stayed for a number of months, for 3 months, in the house of Obed-Edom the Gitti. And 3 months later, David hears that the house of Obed-Edom was blessed. Like everything he touched turned to gold. Not literally, but just he was very, very blessed. So David understood that whatever had happened, it had passed. And now they could bring it up. And this time they didn't put it on a wagon, and the Levites carried it up. And here is where David, again, he's dancing before the ark. He's leading all the people up to Jerusalem. And it says that he was leaping before God with his whole might. He was, the expression in Hebrew, he was like out of his kalim. He was out of his vessels with joy. And here we have a phrase for this kind of joy is called Simcha Poretz Geder. That joy breaks down all boundaries, all inhibitions. So David is leading everyone. And so, of course, if the king is dancing and celebrating like this, so everyone was joining in. So as they come up to Jerusalem, when they get to Jerusalem, so the text says that Michal looks out the window, and it says that she despised David in her heart. She felt that this was not a kingly way to act, that he was just like, besides that he wasn't acting in a kingly manner. And so she was very, very upset. She was very, very proper. Her father was very, very proper. And here, David, remember, David is like the poet king. He is full of enthusiasm, a tremendous warrior, fiery, personality. But here, Michal despised him in her heart. And so when they got to Jerusalem, so David, it says, he gave food to everyone. Everyone who was there, they had prepared this incredible feast. People came from all over. And so before they departed, David made sure that everyone got some bread and meat and a cake of raisins. And then everyone left. So this is interesting. This is just a side point that among the Hasidic Rebbes, it's a tradition that when they get together and there is food, that the Rebbe gives out small portions of food to everyone. It's called shirayim. Shirayim also can mean like leftovers, but here it doesn't mean leftovers. It means like firstovers that the Rebbe personally hands everyone a little piece of cake or whatever the food is. And that's considered a great honor to get this piece of cake from the Rebbe. I should mention that today is Gimel Tammuz. This is the 31st yurtzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, 31 years. And probably everyone's heard that in his later years, when he was in his late 80s and early 90s, he used to stand for quite literally 8 hours, and people would go past him and he would hand them a dollar bill and look at them and give them a blessing. And you can go to YouTube where many people understood they couldn't have a long conversation with the Rebbe, but many people kind of like practiced what they could get in 10 or 15 seconds and would ask for a specific kind of blessing or share some good news or for a healing. And you could see YouTube. There's a number of them. But here, on an average Sunday, around 5,000 people went past the Rebbe in these 8 hours. And like everyone had their, whatever it was, 10, 15 seconds. I got the surprise of my life just a few months ago when my good friend Shlomo Katz, many people know him or have heard of his music. Out of the blue, he sent me a picture of me getting a dollar bill from the Rebbe. And I believe he said somehow through AI, he was able to get this. So I'm going to just show you this picture. Now we're going back probably around 40 to 45 years ago. The Rebbe's been gone for 31 years. I believe this was in the late 70s or early 80s. And you see the Rebbe's eyes looking at me? It's just, you don't forget something like this. And so, okay, this wasn't food, but this is a little bit the same idea that you get this dollar bill from the Rebbe. And the whole point was that then you are supposed to turn around and not give that dollar, but charity from your own money. He was encouraging people to give through example. So I'm just mentioning, here's what King David does. Before everyone leaves, he personally makes sure everyone who came went home with something. Now, David goes to his home, and it says he goes to his house to bless them. In other words, in all of the hullabaloo, he didn't forget his family. Now, last week or the week before, we had a question because when Avner, who was the general of the son of Shaul, Mephibosheth, who later was killed, and through that, David becomes king of all Israel. But David had nothing to do with it. As we know, that David went out of his way never to harm anyone from Shaul to any of his sons. And when Avner decided he's going to, in a certain way, throw his loyalty behind David, David says to him, "You can come, but you have to bring back my wife, Michal." And we had a question. It says that she was brought back to him. He already had a number of other wives. And then it doesn't say like what happened. But now here we see that when David goes home, the main wife who greets him is Michal. And while I'm at it, we had also a question that when King Shaul was killed, it says that the Philistines cut off his head and brought it back to the Philistines to show their great victory, and that they hung or nailed the body of Shaul to the walls of Beit Shan, a very, very ancient city that still exists. And then it says that the people of Benjamin, they risked their lives to get the body of Shaul back and to give it a proper burial. But in the verse, it says that they burned it, and it seems that it's talking about his body. They burned his body, and they took the bones and buried it in the area of Benjamin. So the whole question was, we don't believe in cremation. So the question is, how could the verse imply that they burned his body? And so I looked up the commentaries, and they had the same, they were bothered by this also. And they explain that there's no way that we would understand it, that they actually burned his body as in cremation, even though they then buried the bones. And I mentioned that back then, many times they would bury a body for about a year until all of the flesh pretty much disintegrated into the ground. And all that was left were bones. And then they took the bones and they put it in these little boxes. And that's what they buried. So here, the commentaries say that we need to understand it when it said that they burned it. It probably meant the clothes that he had been wearing, that when they hung his body on the walls. So I'm just clarifying because that was a question that we had. So David comes home, and Michal comes out to greet him. Even before he can come and bless his family, she comes out and she rebukes him. And she says, like, what a terrible thing you did. It was unkingly the way you acted, and especially among the common people. And so David answers back, and it sounds at first a bit prideful, where he says, "You should know that God chose me over your father. Like, your example of kingly mannerisms is from your father. He was the first king. But God chose me over your father." So it sounds a bit egotistical. But then he says the following: the Nikalti od mizot Vayiti shafel be'enai. And what he says is a very, very important verse, because Rav Ginsburg quotes this all the time as far as the inner dimension of the sphere of Malchut. David, of course, is David Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayam. He is the epitome of a Jewish king. And his lineage until Mashiach, they are the kingly family. But David says, the way you looked at me, you thought that I was full of pride and ego. He says, but in my own eyes, Hayiti shafel be'enai. I was very lowly in my own eyes. So here we see what seems like a bit of a contradiction. And especially because the inner dimension of Malchut is Shiflut. From this verse, Hayiti shafel, meaning lowly, existential lowliness. And so this is such an important verse because on the surface it seems contradictory. How could a king who has all the power and does act in a kingly manner, how can he be so lowly in his own eyes? So we have as an example none other than Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was one of the greatest leaders in Jewish history, and yet he was described as being the most humble person on the face of the earth. And yet we see in last week's parsha of Korach, when Moshe had to stand up to the people and sometimes stand up to God, he was full of strength, but his inner feeling was always existential lowliness, existential humbleness. And so this is the true personality, attributes of a leader, a Jewish leader, especially the king. And it's based on this verse, Vayiti shafel be'enai. I was very, very lowly in my own eyes. You might have perceived it as I was grandstanding in front of everyone. But in my own eyes, I was very humble before God. And then the verse says, and Michal, the daughter of Shaul, had no children until the day of her death. Now this can be interpreted in many, many different ways, that she had in a certain way closed herself off spiritually and psychologically and emotionally. And the result was that she had no children. Now, the commentaries point out in a different place in the book of Chronicles, it mentions the children of Michal. So it could mean that from that point on, she had no more children. Or one of the explanations is that her sister, originally, Michal was not the elder sister. And there was a point that it seemed that Shaul wanted David to marry Michal's older sister. But when Shaul became very jealous of David, he canceled that. And her name is Meirav. And in the end, he gave David Michal. And the text says that Michal loved David very, very much. So it was a very good match. So they say that the children that are mentioned in the book of Chronicles were not actually her children. They were the children of Meirav that she helped raise. So as in many, many commentaries, we have different opinions. And in a certain way, we'll never know. but this is not an uncommon thing that we have different opinions of how to read the text. That ends chapter 6. Chapter 7 opens that, if we've been following, David has fought many, many wars up to now. And here it says, at this point, we see David fought many more wars. According to tradition, he fought 18 different wars. And what's interesting is, also according to tradition, he had 18 wives, which is the maximum that a king could have. In those days, it's a different reality right now. In those days, a king could have up to 18 wives. And I heard once Rav Ginsburg made a parallel that he was able to be victorious in 18 battles on the merit of his wives. He had 18 wives and he was victorious 18 times. But here it says that God gave him rest from all of his enemies around. And then David goes to Natan. Natan was the prophet of that age. And David said, how can it be that I live in a house of cedar wood and the ark of God is housed in a tent? When he brought up the ark, there was no temple then. And at that point, even the rest of the Mishkan wasn't there. And that's a whole discussion also. Which ark is this? Because there were actually two arks. There was one ark that stayed in the Mishkan, and there was another ark that sometimes would accompany Israel to war. And that is how the Philistines first captured the ark. And there are other cases when Joshua surrounded Jericho. He also, at God's command, had the ark with him. And so there is a question here. Which ark are we talking about? Did this ark have the 2 tablets of the law in it? Did it have only the broken pieces of the first tablets? Again, it's not 100% clear. But David says to Natan, the prophet, how can it be that I live in like this permanent house and God is in a tent? And so Natan says to him, do what your heart tells you to do. That night, God comes to the prophet Natan, and it takes up a considerable amount, what I'm going to explain now. And God basically says, I'm giving you a message for David. And the message in short was, in all of these years, now at this point, it's approximately 300 and somewhat more than 300 years from the time we received the Torah in Sinai until we came into the land. This is approximately 300 years later. And God says, in all of that time, from the time that the Mishkan was made, now it's true in the desert, the Mishkan was made to be a temporary dwelling. When they brought it to Shiloh, now the Mishkan was, I believe, in 8 different places during those 300 years until the first temple was built. Most of the time it was in Shiloh. But at a certain point, the Philistines had done a lot of harm to Shiloh. And so God says, actually, David, you're the first person who's even thought, shouldn't we build a house for God? Shouldn't God have, as it were, a permanent place? And again, it's like a long, almost a speech that God gives to Natan to go back to David. And God says, because you thought of this, I am going to establish your kingship forever. But it will be your son who will build the temple. Here it doesn't say because you spilled too much blood, but our sages tell us that was the reason that God wanted Shlomo, who his name Shlomo comes from Shalem, comes from Shalom. And Solomon didn't fight any wars. The whole time he ruled for 40 years, there was peace in the land. So this is just a very, very important part of Shmuel Bet, that God is establishing not just that David will be king, but that his lineage will be the kings. Now here we could go back to Yehuda, because when we look at the blessings that Yaakov gave to his sons before he died, the blessing to Yehuda was basically that all of the kings would come from Yehuda, until it says Ad Yavo Shiloh, until Shiloh would come. It's spelled differently than the place Shiloh. Until Shiloh will come. So obviously the commentaries ask, because we don't see a name like Shiloh in the Tanakh, in the context of until Shiloh comes. And so it's pointed out that Yavo Shiloh, Ad Yavo Shiloh, until Shiloh comes. Yavo Shiloh is Gematria Mashiach. And that's the hint that all the kings would be the lineage of David until Mashiach. And we know that until the destruction of the second temple, except for the period where the Maccabees usurped the kingship, they were not supposed to do that because they were Kohanim. They were not from the house of David. But for well over 1,000 years, and even when we went to Babylonia, the lineage of David was guarded, and everyone knew who the lineage was of King David. And in many cases, they became the leaders. They weren't the kings anymore. We were in exile. But they were the leaders of Israel. So this really goes back to Yehuda, where it was already alluded to. But here, God is stating it very exactly. And he ends by saying, according to what I've told you, now you go back to David and relay this to him. And that's what Natan does. And then there's a long speech. We'll call it a speech. It's really a prayer of David before God, where David is saying, like, who am I to merit this kind of eternal kingship? And here again, he's very sincerely expressing his shiflut, being lowly in his own eyes. And then part of his whole speech, he says a very, very important verse. He says, Umi kamocha. This is verse 23 of chapter 7. He says, Umi ka'amcha b'Yisrael, goy echad ba'aretz. Who is like your people, Israel, one nation in the land? Now, this verse is important because on Shabbat, at mincha time, the afternoon prayer, this verse is quoted as really the middle part. There's the three standard blessings in the beginning and the three standard at the end. On Shabbat, we have 7 blessings, not the usual 19. Originally, it was 18. That's why it's called the Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings. You had 3 in the beginning, 3 at the end, and 12 in the middle. Then the sages added 1 later. So there were 13. So in Mincha of Shabbat, the middle blessing starts with this verse. Starts with, actually, it's added, Atah Echad, V'Shimcha Echad, Umi Ka'amcha Yisrael, Goy Echad Ba'aretz. You are one, and your name is one, and who is like your people, one nation in the earth? And it comes from this speech or prayer that David is addressing to God. It has even a deeper meaning that the sages discuss, and now obviously we're talking metaphorically, symbolically, but the sages make almost an outrageous claim that God also wears tefillin. Just like we wear tefillin, God wears tefillin. And so then the sages ask, we know that in our tefillin, there's 4 sections, and the main one is Shema Yisrael. So they ask, well, what is in God's tefillin? What's written? And they bring this verse. Who is like you, Israel, one nation in the world? Just like we say that God is one. In God's tefillin, he's exclaiming that Israel is one. Again, obviously, this is very metaphoric, but very, very profound. David continues. It's a long prayer. David even calls it a prayer. I'm saying a speech, but David himself is praying to God from the depths of his heart. And one of these things he says is, V'yigdal shimcha ad olam. That your name should become great forever. Now, last week, we discussed that when David hears that Shaul and his closest soul brother, Yehonatan, were killed, he laments them in what's called the Kina. And I mentioned that a very, very heartfelt lamentation. A Kina is a lamentation. And in fact, the book that we read on Tisha B'Av, I mentioned that on Tisha B'Av, it's customary to read a whole list of keynote, of lamentations. And in fact, in English, the book of Eicha is called Lamentations. And I just pointed out that, again, David is the poet king. And the way he expressed himself in the Kina became the example of virtually all keynote written in the future. Just like his Psalms became the prototype of Jewish poetry written through the ages. So here, we already discussed in the same prayer that one of the verses that he said is really the main part of Mincha of Shabbat. But here he says that the name of God should become great forever. And we could imagine the importance of this is because the Kaddish begins basically with this idea Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah, that God's name should be holy and great. And then it goes on to say forever. So there's reason to believe, again, because David is I keep on saying, the poet king, and his energy is stamped on all of Jewish literature, all of Jewish prayer for eternity. That's the whole thing. Is God is establishing him as the eternal king, but it's so much more than that. That's what we say, David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. David's energy, and especially we saw it during, really for the last year and a half, how many people have taken upon themselves to say Tehillim. We've been in a war for a year and a half. Even today, another soldier was killed. It's just not over. And so here, I'm just trying to make the point that so many of the words of David reached way beyond his individual psalms or his individual lamentations or his individual prayers. Then we go to chapter 8. In chapter 8, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but David is back at war. We have to remember in those days, in these days, there's wars everywhere. And it's not just between Israel and its enemies. Syria just went through a 15-year civil war. Something like 600,000 people were killed. And something like 2 million people fled Syria, mostly to Europe. Lebanon had their civil war in the 70s. It went on and on and on and on. Saudi Arabia has been fighting with Yemen for many, many years. So without mentioning every single war, we know what happened in Iraq, Afghanistan, just a week ago in Iran. Here, David is back at war. It's just that no one left each other alone in those days. And here in chapter 8, it just mentions many of David's conquests. And what it does mention is in the 3rd verse, it says that he stretched his hand all the ways to the river. And then in the column outside of the text, the oral tradition, all it says is the river. But the oral tradition is that you should read it to the river Euphrates, in Hebrew, Prat. He reached to the Euphrates. And that is the bigger borders that were promised to Avram. The Euphrates is in modern Iraq. And David's kingdom spread to a good part of Lebanon, almost all of Syria, Iraq, what we call Jordan today. It was called Transjordan. There was never a country called Jordan in all of history. They made it up after World War I. Most of the countries were made up after World War I. People in a room with pens and maps, and they carved up the Middle East into countries that in that form had never existed before. Anyways, that's a different subject. But here we see that David's conquests were enormous. And one of the verses says, actually, it's repeated a number of times, where it says that God was with David, and he was the reason for all of the success. That David was behind, he was the power behind the king. And like I said, there's a lot of details here, but it names all the different countries that David conquered. And then in the middle of the chapter, it says that God gave David victory wherever he went. And David ruled over all of Israel. And it says that he executed judgment and justice to all of his people. In other words, David was not just conquering other people. And we have to remember that his conquering other people is because they wanted to conquer him. So it was ongoing warfare, but a lot of it was preemptive, just like we just preempted Iran, because it's been known for 40 years that it was only a matter of time that we would have to confront Iran, because they made it clear they had every intention to destroy Israel. They didn't try to hide it, and they worked feverishly for decades to build up all of the peoples around Hezbollah and the Houthim and Hamas, and they took over Syria, and they threatened Jordan and Saudi Arabia. So David conquered all of these people, but he also ruled with justice, and he established judgment. And David, according to tradition, was a very, very fair king, and he really set the stage for Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, to rule with justice and compassion. As you know, we're not going over every single verse here. The 8th chapter, though, ends with kind of like a lineup of his main staff. And here it says that Yoav, he was like the general of the army. Yehoshaphat was his scribe. Sadok and Avimelech, the sons of Eviatar, were the main priests, the Kohanim. And Beniyahu, the son of Yehoiada, were his ministers. So these names will come up again. That's why I'm mentioning it. And now we'll end for tonight with chapter 9. And here, David, as we mentioned many times, he had many chances to kill Shaul HaMelech, and he didn't. When his son was ruling, and David was only ruling in Yehuda, David did not lift a finger to outdo Mephibosheth. But we learned that his own people ended up killing him. And then eventually David became king. So here in chapter 9, he asks, is there anyone left from the house of Shaul? Because I would like to help take care of them. And so it turns out that there was a son of Yehonatan. Now, Yehonatan was the son of Shaul, and that was David's closest friend. And apparently Yehonatan had a son. And we've mentioned him before, that when he was 5 years old and his father Yehonatan was killed and his grandfather Shaul was killed, so his nurse was trying to like spirit him away because she was afraid the Philistines would get him. And what happened here? Okay, good. And she was carrying him and she dropped him. And somehow the way he got dropped, it might have been a spinal injury, but he was lame in both of his feet for his whole life. And so David was told, well, there is this son of Yonatan. And so David sent for him, and David said to him, don't be, when he came, he like bowed down to the king, and David said, I called you here because I want to show you kindness. And he basically set it up that he supported the son of Yehonatan for the rest of his life. And the way it's turned is that he ate at his table. In other words, he became like part of his extended family. And he took care of this child of Yehonatan for the rest of his life. And he also took care of his family. He was older now. He wasn't a child anymore. And so he had a family and he had a household, and David took care of all of them. He took care of all of them. And that is the end of chapter 9. So here I just want to mention, you will get notices, but next Sunday, there will not be a class. My wife and I are going to Tzfat for around 8 days. For those of you who tune in on this Tuesday, there won't be a class this Tuesday and next Sunday. But the following Tuesday, there will be classes again. So we're only missing one Sunday and one Tuesday. Welcome, everyone, to Insights into the Weekly Haftarah. This week's Haftarah comes from the book of Judges. The Torah portion is Chukat. This portion is very, very full. This is the red heifer, the paraduma. It's called the paradox of the Torah, where this is the way that a person would purify themselves from the impurity of death. In this parsha, many things happen. Many things happen. Aaron passes away. Miriam passes away. Moshe hits the rock instead of talking to it. And because of that, God says you can't lead the people into Eretz Yisrael. There are the burning snakes that come and bite the people. So there's many, many things happening here. And one of them, kind of in between all of these, which we know there's a lot of commentary about, it tells a story of how Israel is getting towards wanting to come into Eretz Yisrael. This is, remember, this is after the spies. But anyways, Israel's still in the desert and wants to pass through a number of countries. And so Moshe sends messengers with like a peaceful suggestion that we want to pass through your land. We will stay on the main highway. We'll pay for any water, anything that we use. We're not threatening you. We don't want war. We just need to go through your country to get to where we need to go. And Moshe is not given his request, put it that way. And so it's not even clear, but that is the theme of the Haftarah, which is interesting because there are other, like, I wouldn't call them more important, but more commentaries on, more things to ponder. So we would think that there would be something that would parallel these other incidences. And yet, the incident that is chosen is coming from the book of Judges. And this is the story of Yiftach. And it's from Judges 11, verse 1 through 33. So in the middle of the book of Judges, there is a person called Yiftach. And Yiftach, so he's described immediately as a gibor, like very strong and mighty person of valor. And here it says that he is the son of a zona, of a prostitute. But it could have been maybe a concubine. But the other brothers that are born to the father of Yiftach see him as like an illegitimate child. And he is kind of banished from the family. And he goes off by himself. He leaves the family and he sets himself up. And what's interesting here, we had the case with David, that when David was running away from Shaul, it says everyone who was dissatisfied, who couldn't find their proper place, was kind of an outcast, joined David. That was his first core group. We learned about this. There were 400 men, and then there were 600 men. Interesting here, but it uses a different language. Here it says everyone who was like empty-handed. But it could mean the same thing. It was just people who just didn't fit in joined Yiftach. He was a very, very strong personality, but from his own family, he was an outcast, which is very similar to David. David was also an outcast from his family. But the story goes on that at a certain point, the children of Ammon, the nation of Ammon, wants to do war with Israel. And the tribes are fearful. And they come to Yiftach and say, you're a man of strength. You lead us into war. And Yiftach, it's a classic statement, says, all of a sudden, you recognize me? Like, I've been an outcast virtually my whole life, and now you're coming to me and saying you need me? And he says to them, I'll lead you into battle on one condition, that if I'm successful, I will become your leader. Not king, there weren't kings yet, but I will be your leader. And they agree. So here's the part that is the parallel to the Parsha, that Yiftach sends messengers to Ammon. So this is similar to Moshe sending emissaries, and here he's he's trying to make peace here because Ammon is threatening Israel. And Yiftach says, why have you come to make war in my land? All of a sudden, why do we need this? And Ammon answers, well, you took our land when you came into Eretz Yisrael. Now, this is like, Yiftach says, this is like 300 years later. They say, you conquered our land. So Yiftach goes into a whole soliloquy explaining to them, well, it really wasn't your land to begin with. You originally took it from Moab, and you called it your own. And then we took it from you, and now you want it back hundreds of years later? Like, let's just settle this peacefully. Let's like just come down from your the branch that you put yourself on. But Ammon did not listen. And in the end, again, you have to read in the 11th chapter of Judges how Yiftach addresses them and basically says, you have no right to that land. We've had it for all of these years, so just give it up. Of course, they didn't. And so Yiftach went to war. And here it says that Vatahi al Yiftach Ruach Hashem. And it was that the Spirit of God was upon Yiftach. Now here we saw very similar to Shimshon, that Samson, that when he would exhibit his great strength, it was really only because the Ruach of Hashem had entered into him. We learned in the book of Judges that Shimshon ordinarily was just as strong or as weak as anyone else. But when the Ruach of Hashem would enter into him, we see, for those who are following our Tuesday classes, so we see in the book of Ezekiel that many times he uses a similar expression, that the Ruach of God was upon him. So here, the Ruach of God is with Yiftach, and he goes out to battle. But before he goes to battle, he makes a vow. Now, what's interesting is the Haftorah ends with Yiftach going out to battle and being victorious. And then the Haftorah ends. It doesn't continue what happened with this vow. Yiftach made a vow, a very innocent vow. And in a way, saying to God that if you will help me and I am victorious, the first thing that comes out of my house to greet me, I will offer up to you. Now, it's obvious that what he had in mind was that when he came back, well, imagine that he didn't even literally mean his house, but his yard, his farm, his ranch, whatever it was, that an animal would come, run out to him. Obviously, he probably had sheep and goats and cows. And his intention was that he would bring an offering to God. Again, the Haftorah ends, just he makes the vow, he goes to war, and he's victorious. But the continuation of the story in the book of Judges is that when he comes home, his daughter comes out to greet him in great joy that you've come back from the war, you were victorious. And here, it's hard for us to understand, for those who have been following this class, and we did the book of Judges, so we went into this in great depth, that it's obvious that Yiftach couldn't offer his daughter. And yet we see that even though that's obvious, that, and the law is if someone makes a vow and in a way that they didn't mean it the way it turned out. In other words, it was like a mistaken vow. The assumptions were just wrong. The expectations were just wrong. That you can have a vow annulled by a court. Doesn't even have to be, three great rabbis. It could just be a regular court. But Yiftach was very stubborn, and the main Cohen at the time was Pinchas, and he was like, well, if Pinchas wants to come to me and annul my vow, let him come to me. And Pinchas said the same thing. I should go to him. He's the one who made the vow. He should come to me. So they point out, again, Yiftach was a great person. Pinchas was a great tzaddik, but no one's perfect. So they point out that in this particular case, a little bit of ego gets in the way, a little bit. And so what happens is that, and again, it's not easy for us to understand because they should have just annulled the vow. That according to tradition, the daughter of Yiftach, so she obviously loved her father very much and honored him very much and understood the difficult situation he was in. And so it's written, and it's not exactly clear, but it just says that she went with her girlfriends and they mourned her virginity. And it says that she kind of lived in isolation for the rest of her life and never married. Now, this is a tragic story and ended up very tragically. I'm just mentioning it because it's not part of the Haftarah. The Haftarah leaves it off, put this on a high note. But it didn't end up so well for Yiftach and his daughter. I'll just mention that this even though it's not in the Haftarah, that there might be a very, very subtle hint here, because one of the very mysterious, paradoxical incidences in this parsha is why such a harsh punishment that Moshe, for hitting the rock and not speaking to the rock, is not allowed to come into Eretz Yisrael. There's so much discussion about this. For those who have Orchard of Delights, I discuss it at great length. Many possibilities of what did Moshe do wrong here? What was the main, we'll call it, I won't call it a sin, but the main thing that Moshe did wrong. And one of them is that if you read the whole text, it appears that Moshe got angry at the people and a bit of ego flared in him, and a little bit of anger flared in Moshe. And the hitting of the rock, in a certain way, was an expression of his feelings at that point. He was just exasperated with the people. And so a little bit of pride here, even with someone like Moshe, has repercussions. So it could be that, like I say, a very, very subtle, because anyone who reads the Haftarah probably knows the continuation of the story with Yiftach and his daughter. And here again, it's like a little bit of ego in the wrong place led to, for the daughter, who showed incredible love and honor and loyalty to her father, but a little bit of pride. So here we see with Moshe also. So this could be another subtle reason why this Haftarah was chosen.